Hello, my name is Kennedy Moore with the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. Today I'm joined by Dr. Emily Conroy-Krutz. Dr. Krutz is a professor at Michigan State University with an emphasis in global history of the early American Republic, focusing on the dimensions of religion and reform. Dr. Kratz will be joining us on campus on April 27th from 6 to 7:30 in McCord Auditorium to discuss her new book, Missionary Diplomacy: Religion in 19th Century America Through Foreign Relations. Thank you, Dr. Kratz, for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the first question I want to ask you is what got you interested in this topic? This is definitely something that many historians don't highlight, missionary work and diplomacy. So what sparked this for you?
I have long been interested in the connections between religion and politics in general, and foreign relations more specifically. Um, and I think part of it has to do with sort of just having a lot of questions about it and not being really sure what the story was. I, like a lot of historians of my generation, sort of came to grad school after 9/11, sort of seeing that religion really mattered to the history of to the sort of the current experience of foreign relations, and wondering then what that longer history was. So I started working on missionaries when I was in grad school and got really interested in what seemed to me this kind of untold story about missionary engagement with empire in the early 19th century. And for this book, and that resulted in my first book, my called Christian Imperialism. Missionary diplomacy came really out of wanting to dig a little bit deeper into not just how sort of missionaries were thinking about the US role in the world, but how the American government was responding to that and what missionaries did to really shape American foreign policy from the early 19th century into the sort of going to the 1920s in the book. And some of the sort of ways that we sort of may not expect missionaries to be acting in the background and shaping some of the conversations with quite high-ranking policy figures and making a real difference for how the U.S. acted in the world.
Absolutely. In your book, you highlight how Protestant missionaries, such as the McCartys, not only pursued religious work, but also played a significant role in shaping U.S. diplomatic relations. Through some of like the anecdotal stories that you use, while some missionaries acted altruistically, some were inadvertently spreading U.S. cultural and political influence, while diplomats capitalized on their presence to advance national interests. So, given this complex relationship and dynamic, how did the missionary diplomacy shape U.S. conceptions of citizenship abroad and humanitarian intervention?
This is a great sort of multi-layered question, and I love it. And so one of the things I like the best about it is how you're sort of getting at the different ways that missionaries acted, and the way that they sort of, however they were approaching their work, it could sort of turn out differently than they expected. And so, yes, these are folks who are absolutely going out into the world, hoping to make it a better place. Um, we might disagree with how they framed that, but that was certainly their intent. And they were absolutely working to shape US political influence and US cultural influence because they thought that sort of if you made so they understood that the world would be more open to missionary work and to their missionary work in particular if the world was more open to the US. They saw sort of connections between these movements. But this what you can edit this right out though.
Yes,
The
absolutely. You're fine.
to the question of citizenship, what's really important for us to think about is, the missionaries are going out. The first American missionaries are leaving in 1812. This is not a period in which it was particularly clear what rights American citizens had when they were overseas, and particularly when they're overseas doing some of the kind of stuff that missionaries were doing, which was sometimes breaking the law, sometimes ignoring treaty arrangements, things like this, and kind of messing with the status quo. And so missionaries really did, from the early 19th century, sort of well into the mid 19th century, one of the questions that they were really engaged with was what rights did they have? What could they expect their government to do to protect them overseas? And this comes up, quite early. There's a story that I really was fascinated by in my research, where missionaries in Hawaii in the 1830s were really surprised to hear a sort of French captain who was coming in and trying to have some diplomatic relations with the Hawaiian government at that time. This captain said that the missionaries had basically denationalized themselves and they were not U.S. citizens, and he didn't need to treat them as such. And the missionaries were horrified because they understood themselves to be U.S. citizens. And so there's this interesting flurry of letters between Honolulu and Washington, D.C., and Boston, where the missionary organization that these folks worked for was based, about, you know, what can the government do? And that was just one of many, many incidents where you had missionaries kind of leaning on the government and asking this question of, what can we expect? And this is particularly important because they are doing things, as I said, not always legal, but more importantly, right, they're doing things to advance a religious cause. And so, what in fact is the responsibility of the US state when you have folks who are going abroad out of religious interests, who are finding themselves in trouble with local people or local governments? And what we see in the 19th century context is that over and over again, the answer that the state has is that, yeah, they will step in and they will defend those American citizens, because even when they are um, going out for religious purposes, and when they are, getting into all kinds of trouble in various ways that I talk about in the book, they are in really important ways, doing these activities as Americans. And the state largely understands, or just as missionaries thought, that the sort of what would benefit the state would benefit missions. From most of the 19th century, the American government believes that what kind of is going to benefit missions is going to ultimately benefit the state as well. There's this sort of symbiotic relationship going on. And so if we focus on this missionary diplomacy story, we can really see some of the ways that what any kind of American citizen could expect their government to do to protect them is sort of being worked out through the experiences of these religious individuals.
It's really interesting. I've never heard anybody talk about it like that, which is really fascinating. So I wanted to ask you, how did the relationship evolve over time, especially because the US maintains this constitutional separation of church and state, yet your work highlights how missionary activity and diplomacy frequently overlap, like how you mentioned the symbiotic relationship. Even when not state sponsored, it kind of acted as this like safeguard. Um, First, my personal question would be like, was that intentional on the behalf of the diplomats? Was that more out of like convenience? Um, and then my second question, my more formal question, is how did that relationship evolve over time? And do you see missionary diplomacy continuing to shape U.S. engagement with the world, particularly in regions where religious organizations play a major humanitarian role?
Mhm. Absolutely. So, I mean, to your very last question, yes, I think that this all still really matters, which is why I think that understanding the larger story, the larger history, really can help us to see what's happening now, and to help us think about the dynamics right now with sort of how religious organizations play into what is not what, today we have a very large bureaucracy of humanitarian work within the State Department. And the sort of getting a sense of where these sort of religious bodies sort of played in the longer history of developing that, I think really helps us to appreciate what's going on right now. Um, but sort of to go back to sort of how that's changed over time and sort of when it started and why it started, um, that question of sort of, is this a matter of convenience or is it intentional, is really important, because it's both. And to a certain extent, it depends on, there are individual differences, right? And so if we're talking about, there are, some diplomats who found this infuriating and really didn't like the missionaries. And so there's, folks I talk about in China in particular who are just pulling their hair out. Why are missionaries causing so many problems? Why am I spending so much of my time dealing with these missionaries? But there are others who see the missionaries as real allies who are, may have personal commitments to Protestant Christianity, and so sort of be interested in furthering it that way. But who also see the work that missionaries are doing in fields like medicine and in education as sort of setting the stage for sort of a bigger kind of goodwill work that the state wants to do. Um, it's in the early part of the 19th century, the reason that missionaries are able to kind of put themselves in the position to do this kind of work and to sort of partner with the government in the way that they do is largely that the state is really weak in the early 19th century. And so, coming from sort of thinking about right now when you have all sorts of agencies and all sorts of organizations doing this work. In the first half of the 19th century, if you want to know what is happening in various parts of the Middle East, a lot of Asia, Africa, the folks who are on the ground, the Americans who are on the ground, who can give you information, are missionaries, not employees of the state. And so you see this sort of emergence of missionaries as the experts, the American experts who can explain the world, who can sort of tell the State Department what's going on when the State Department is sort of interested. There's a one of the kind of aha moments for me in the research here was finding a letter from the Secretary of State to the director of one of these missionary organizations asking for a list of the Americans in Jerusalem at the time, because the people who would know that information were the missionaries, not the government officials. And that's exactly right. And so I had a lot of fun making maps and doing things like this when I was working on the research, getting a sense of these huge swaths of the globe that for much of the 19th century, the missionaries are the Americans on the ground. And so we see over the course of the century, the state kind of follows where the missionaries go. Missionaries kind of get started in certain regions and then are finding themselves needing more support. And so asking for, when is the consul going to come? When are we going to get more sort of more U.S. power behind us here? Because it becomes clear that this is, new treaties, new consular officials, new diplomats are going to sort of allow them to expand their work further. And it's in the late 19th century that we really see kind of the tip over of sort of that balance where you have more diplomats, you have sort of the power is sort of more held in the bureaucracy of the state, and the missionaries are then just kind of following along where the government is going and sort of taking advantage of the presence of both the American diplomatic and in some places the military apparatus to spread their work. And so that's kind of the change over time that I see is sort of an earlier 19th century experience where the sort of the expertise and the power and the sort of boots on the ground is focused in the missionary organizations. And into the 19th and the 20th century, that does shift. But because you have this long tradition by that point of missionaries being enmeshed in this whole apparatus, they continue to have a really important role in shaping those conversations.
Wow, that's really interesting. It really puts in perspective how much the US was a thought experiment
Mm.
and how like it was still being formulated. I really like that part about how like the State Department calling the missionaries for their citizen count, which is crazy to think about today. That would never happen. But yeah.
Mhm.
Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, missionaries often acted as unofficial diplomats, influencing U.S. engagement in Asia, Africa, the Pacific, and the Middle East. While formal diplomatic structures, like you discussed, have evolved, do you still see those remnants of diplomacy in modern U.S. foreign policy today? And do you think it'll ever have this like resurgence of a global role?
Ooh, I don't want to predict the future, so I won't speak to whether it will have a resurgence. But I do think that we see the legacy of this 19th century story today. in really important ways. I mean, one is with the importance of humanitarian actions with, well, I should say, humanitarian priorities in American diplomacy. Um, the missions were absolutely at the forefront of, and then sort of in partnership with many other um, sort of non-government organizations that worked to push the state at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, and sort of in the first decade of the 20th century to prioritize humanitarian work as something that, should be a cornerstone and sort of a guiding light of American foreign policy. It was a central logic of this sort of 19th century story, um, and I think really is one of its most sort of powerful and positive legacies of sort of really emphasizing that when the U.S. and its people were doing work that, the foreign communities understood made their lives better, whether that's in advancing educational opportunities or medical training and medical services, or in uh, sort of literary efforts and things like this, which missionaries are all over, and farming as well, which I don't really get too much into industrial education in the book, but it's a big effort that they're doing as well. The mission movements in the 19th century are pretty committed to, right, the kind of goodwill that work does is going to lead to positive effects for American foreign relations, and sort of creating both soft power and also creating partnerships and creating goodwill. That logic continues today in some circles, and is I think a really important legacy of this work. Um, I would say another legacy of this work that is maybe a little more complicated to think about because of, that point about the separation of church and state that you mentioned earlier, is that, religious organizations were and sometimes are able to sort of get the ear of important political figures and shape priorities in ways that, sometimes are clear and sometimes aren't very clear to Americans watching from the outside. And so I do think that we see, still today, some of the ways that, priorities of particularly Protestant organizations like the missionaries that I study can have outsized influence on American foreign policy because of kind of a casual assumption that some of the government have that those Christian values are American values as such. And I think that is another legacy of the missionary diplomacy I explore in the book that is timely and important to think about today.
If you had to pitch your lecture to maybe a finance or trumpet major, somebody that's not traditionally interested in history, what would you say to them to have them sit down for an hour and listen to your lecture?
Ooh, that's a good question. So what would I say to a finance major or a trumpet? Trumpet, you said?
Yeah,
Is
trumpet
there a trumpet? That's
performance.
amazing. My daughter will be thrilled. She's a violinist. What I would say is that if you have ever wanted to hear a story about an American woman who believed that wearing an emblem of the U.S. flag on her dress would protect her while going out into the Middle East and preaching Christianity to folks who didn't necessarily want to hear it, have I got a story for you? We're going to be talking about the ways that sort of American missionaries were sort of going out into the world fully expecting the US government to have their back as they tried to evangelize. And as we will see, this led to all kinds of adventures, all kinds of unexpected um, experiences, and some really important implications for sort of not just understanding the American past, but also thinking about the world we live in today.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kretz, for meeting with me today. For all those watching, please join us on April 27th in McCord Auditorium from 6 to 7:30 to hear from Dr. Kretz herself about her wonderful new book. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to seeing you all soon.